Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Code with Jason Meetup. This time we're going to be talking about how to organize Rails controllers. And this is another one that kind of ties into the ideas that I'll be putting into my book that I'm working on, which is called Growing Large Rails Applications, which if you want to find it, you can just Google Growing Large Rails Applications and it should come up if you want to see what it's all about. In an earlier Code with Jason Meetup session, we talked about Rails models. What is a Rails model and how can you organize your models and stuff like that? Today, we'll be focusing on controllers. This might be a bit of a shorter topic because there's a little bit less to it, but these tips that I'm about to share today, I found really helpful when I figured these things out, and my controllers have been a lot cleaner ever since. So let's dive in. Today, I'm going to be sharing like 4 tactics for keeping controllers tidy and organized and all that. So as a Rails application grows, I'm sure you guys have experienced this, and we saw this actually last week in the code review that I did. Controllers have a tendency to grow beyond the 7 default actions. When I say that, I'm talking about index, show, create, those 7 default actions. When a Rails app gets large and stuff like that, you'll get these custom actions. And initially, it's maybe not so bad when there's just one custom action. But if you've ever seen a controller that's really big and long and it has maybe even more custom actions than the default actions, it can get a little bit tricky to look at. Any of you guys ever experienced that where you have a controller that has some custom actions and it's harder to understand? Yeah. So we're going to talk about ways to cut down on that. And I'll say that even one custom action, even if it's just one, that can be a little bit, it costs something because you come across it. It was kind of like in the code review again last week. You come across it and it's like, what does this belong with? Does this belong with index or show? And you have to go and see where it's called from. It adds a bit of cost. So my opinion is better just to not have any of those if you can avoid it. So the first tactic of the 4 is just move things out of the controller into models. You don't have to move them into the model. You could move them somewhere else conceivably, but that's the main place that I find when I have a controller action that has some bulk. If I'm working on a legacy project or something like that, I'll take what's in that controller action and move it into the model. Provided, of course, that it's something appropriate to put in the model. It isn't always, but I find 8 times out of 10, the stuff that's in the controller could be reconceived as model code, and so I put it in a model. And if somebody's watching this on YouTube later, you can reference my other talk that I gave on my YouTube channel. It's called like, what is a Rails model? Something like that. It was another Code with Jason Meetup recording. Anyway, that advice that you guys have probably heard before of skinny controllers and fat models, I think that's good advice. I try to push code from the controller down to the model layer. So that's one thing. Tactic number 2 is sometimes when you have a controller that has a lot of stuff in it, you can identify what I call a hidden resource. So sometimes there's just a hidden idea that's begging to be realized. It's just that nobody has identified it and given it a name yet. Takes a little bit of thought sometimes, but sometimes when you look at a controller, you can see, oh, okay, this is the such and such controller, but about half the stuff actually refers to this other certain idea. And so maybe you can give that idea a name, maybe even create a Poro model behind that idea, and move some of that code from your original controller to a Poro and even to a new controller. I'll give an example here. So I worked on an app once that had the concept of messages, and it was it was basically just a way for internal employees to communicate with one another. They could send each other a message, and it was exactly what you would imagine it to be. And then at one point, there was a new feature request for employees to be able to send PTO requests to whoever they needed to send it to. Architecturally, it made the most sense to persist PTO requests as messages. So a PTO request was just a message. There was no single table inheritance even or anything like that. It was just a message just dressed up a little bit in the UI. But if we had our messages controller and had some PTO request stuff there, it made that messages controller lose a bit of cohesion. You know, we talked about cohesion before, where a file has high cohesion if everything in the file relates to each other, and low cohesion if it doesn't. So when we had this controller that was all about messages, but then all of a sudden there's this little bit of stuff that has to do with PTO requests, it's like we have this general thing called a message, and then this peripheral specific thing called a PTO request, and it's mixed in with this other thing that harmed the cohesion of the file. So what I did was I said, I think there's a hidden resource here called a PTO request. In this case, it wasn't so subtle because it already had a name and everything. But I took that stuff and I put it in a new controller called PTO requests controller. And just to emphasize, there was no model or database table or anything like that called PTO request. There was only a table called messages. It's just that this controller was taking this idea of a PTO request and just saying, I'm deciding now that there's a resource called PTO request. There's a route for it. There's a controller for it, even though there's not a database table for it. I don't think there was any kind of Poro for it or anything in this case. It was just a controller. And I want to share that because for me, it took me a while to realize that I could have controllers that weren't backed by active record models. You're not limited by that. You can have a controller be whatever you want if you think it makes sense to have it. So that's how I was able to avoid putting that PTO request related stuff into the messages controller and hurt the cohesion of the messages controller. And I could have this separate controller that packaged up all that PTO request stuff. Okay, so that's that idea of a hidden resource. Question in the chat: did you extend the messages controller or keep that totally independent? Good question. I don't remember. I think my first inclination would be to keep it totally independent if I can, so that those two controllers are totally uncoupled from each other. Because obviously when two things are coupled with one another in any way, that means you might have to understand one in order to understand the other. So my inclination, if I could, would be to have them not connected at all. But honest answer is I just don't remember. So that's tactic 2. Tactic 3 is looking at the same resource through different lenses. So I'll share the way I structured a certain feature, and you can kind of imagine how this would go if I hadn't done it this way, but this wasn't a refactoring. I just went straight here because I already knew it made sense. So I had an application with appointments, and appointments could be looked at through different metaphorical lenses by different kinds of people. Depending on who I was or what I was doing, I might view appointments in a scheduling context. A patient might call me and I schedule an appointment for them. That's totally a scheduling context. But if, for example, I'm a billing person, I don't necessarily care when the appointment happened. I care more about the billing related details of the appointment. And so I actually had a number of controllers for appointments, but I had at least 2. One it was called appointments controller, but it was inside a namespace called scheduling. So I had scheduling : appointments controller. And then I also had billing : appointments controller. So again, same resource, 2 different lenses. And you can imagine how if I had tried to just put all this stuff in a single controller called appointments controller, wouldn't be very cohesive. I'd be dealing with multiple concerns in the same file. It'd be a lot tougher. But by splitting those up and having one controller for each way that you could look at an appointment, it made it really nice and tidy. So that's tactic 3. And then tactic 4 is a little bit more of a minor one, but it still helps me out a lot. So tactic 4 is dealing with collections separately. So maybe you guys have seen a control. I've certainly written controllers like this where you have like you have an action called create, and then you have an action called bulk create or batch create or something like that. And of course, instead of creating one resource, it creates a number of them. I've had controllers where it's like bulk create, bulk edit, there's multiple actions prefixed with bulk, and it just doesn't feel very elegant. And again, that's a loss of cohesion because in most places you're dealing with just one resource at a time, but then in some place you're dealing with collections. And the collection stuff tends, either you're doing stuff with collections or you're doing stuff with individuals. It's not usually a mixture of the two. So what I realized at one point is instead of having bulk create and bulk edit, for example, I could just have a separate controller. So let's say I have a products controller with index create, blah, 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 just the default stuff. Then I can have a product collections controller. And then I just have create and edit. The implication being that when I'm creating a product collection, I'm just creating multiple products. When I'm editing a product collection, I'm editing multiple products. And so that helps. Again, that's a bit of a minor one, but definitely a useful tactic I've found. That's it for my presentation. Today's a bit of a shorter one. Any comments or questions or anything like that from anybody?
Hey, Jason. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. All right, let's go Helmet and then Jim.
Okay. So, when you realize that there's a hidden resource that maybe needs to be extracted and made its own, are there any tips beyond just having to do a, find and replace throughout your code base for making changes, like adding things to it, creating a new namespace, adding things to a namespace? It's just when I've wanted to do that, it's just kind of clunky, having to go through everything with just a, find and replace and looking at each instance, making sure that I'm not missing something that might mess me up by just letting it find and replace everything. So I was just curious if there are any additional tips than doing it manually like that.
Yeah, good question. So there are editors that have refactoring tools that automate some of that work. If I were a smarter person, I probably would use such a tool, but I've actually never used any tool like that. I just manually do the grunt work because that kind of stuff for me happens sufficiently infrequently that it's not an unbearable amount of grunt work. But there's kind of two things in my mind. There's the grunt work cost, and then there's the risk that you expose yourself to by doing those refactorings. And it sounds like you were maybe referring to both those things.
Right. In fear of the risk, I do the grunt work and just,
yeah.
And then, if you're in a hurry, then maybe you don't end up doing that refactoring, when you should, and then it piles up, as tech debt and yeah. So anyway, just curious if there was a smoother way.
I can make a couple hopefully helpful comments. One is that obviously it helps if you're starting with good test coverage, because then you can be reasonably confident that any change you're making that introduces a regression is going to be caught by your test suite. But not everybody has that. And even if you have high confidence in your test suite, it still feels a little bit risky sometimes to make those really broad changes. So what I try to do is when I have broad changes like that, I try to do them in small batches. Like maybe, for example, if I'm conceiving of a new resource, I'll make the new controller, and then I'll just move over one action or something like that. And I'll obviously run the tests, and I'll deploy that to production, wait a period of time, a couple days or something like that. And then maybe I'll do the next little batch. I always like to do those kinds of things in small batches to mitigate the risk. And usually in my experience, that helps quite a bit.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I guess I've got a couple comments, but expanding on the hidden resource, with larger, complex applications, I found it really useful to have a pattern that says, here is a PO that really represents all the objects on the page. And then when I can do a submit, it tends to be, whether it's a submit or a get or anything, it tends to be directed at that new PO. And within that PO, I can gather together the separate objects that I need. And if that means, a multi-stage save, that makes it relatively, I don't want to say relatively, it just makes it easier to do that.
Interesting.
So I instituted that pattern on a number of complex pages. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to do that on a relatively simple page. We talked about view components in a previous, and decorators, and those tend to fill in those gaps for things that don't belong in a model. But for those really large, complex pages, you often have different resources, whether they're hidden or not. And splitting and creating a object that represents the page seems to simplify things.
Okay, let me see if I understand what you mean. I'll maybe share a similar example, and you can tell me if it's the same thing you're talking about or not.
Okay.
So I had a case in one of my apps one time. I don't remember what the resource was called or anything like that, but it was a case where I didn't have a database table, but I had a form, and for whatever reason, I decided it made sense to have a Poro object, plain old Ruby object. And a lot of people don't know this maybe, but you can attach active model to a Poro and then have a form associated with that Poro. You don't have to have a database table in order to have a form for it. So I did that in that case. And so basically all the way down, stopping before the database table, it was the same as any other Rails resource. Is that a similar idea or is that the same idea as what you're talking about, or are you talking about something different?
That sounds very similar to what I like to do. And I really enjoy including active job. I like the Ruby on Rails life cycle of an active record object. And since that's split into active job as of what was that, Rails 3 or 4, I found that a really, really useful pattern.
Yeah, me too. Sorry, was it active model maybe as opposed to active job?
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that really useful too, because a lot of times, you'll want all the same stuff like validations and such. You just don't always need or want a database table associated with that form.
Yeah. And another thing that caught my ear while you were talking was your fourth point. And you were talking about, like, for instance, a bulk update, and therefore you may have two different controllers, one to handle an update and one to handle a bulk update. I've used a similar pattern with growing applications, but also with workflows. So I would have, say, a single object that I have to handle. But I think a good example would be a work order. And I would find it, instead of trying to have a single controller that would handle, this is how this type of work order is handled. Instead, I would split it into multiple controllers to say, hey, this controller handles the workflow for this type of work order. This controller handles the workflow for this other type of work order.
I think
and that really allowed us to simplify code. And that's really what we were going for was we felt very confident on the state of the object, a lot of unit tests that made that object very solid for workflows. But the controller started to get very clunky with trying to say, oh, no, if then else, type logic. And that helps simplify that as well.
Got it. Yeah, I think maybe if there's one takeaway that I want people to take away from this session, it's that you're not limited to having your controllers and models have a one-to-one relationship. You can create whatever kind of controllers you want to.
Yeah, I think I listened to DHH give a talk on that once. And he was like, yes, I love to add tons and tons of controllers. So that's one of the few DHH quotes I like to throw out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw it was a post, maybe not by DHH, but it was a post about the way that DHH does controllers. And I actually didn't quite agree with the particular way that the examples were done. And normally I agree with the vast majority of DHH's technical opinions, but that was one where I had a slightly different idea. But that might have been part of what turned me on to this idea of like, oh yeah, it doesn't have to be one-to-one. You can have more controllers that do whatever you want.
Yeah, hey, that's my comments. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just gonna say real quick, like to that last point, it's funny because I think even in, like if you go in the Rails guides, the like getting started section, like one of the first things you do over there is just make like a empty controller action just like from the view sends back hello world, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's like it's funny how quickly that notion of just in the controller, it doesn't have to instantiate an instance of anything, or like you said, like be backed by some sort of database table, like how quickly that kind of gets, behind us. Cause like, I know I've written like static controller home, for like the home page when you're like not logged in or something. Right. I've done that so many times, and I know like, I never ever like think of that when I like just need like a random thing, like you're saying, that doesn't need to give back any data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I distinctly recall creating a static pages controller as one of the first steps for Michael Hartle's Rails tutorial.
See,
Then then I never connected that idea to a real feature. I think sometimes, people go through these exercises in tutorials, but then it's not easy later to connect it to a real world use case. And I think that happened to me too. That made me remember another inspiration that I had was looking at the source code for Devise, because Devise has, for example, user registration controllers and user session controllers. So I thought that was really, it's not necessarily an obvious leap to go from I'm signing in and I'm signing out to I'm creating a session and I'm destroying a session. But once it's conceptualized like that, it's totally obvious in hindsight. So once I saw that, that led me to apply a little more imagination to controllers that I created. And it helped with that idea of a hidden resource. I'm just going to catch up on the chat here and see if I had missed anything. No, it doesn't look like I really missed anything. Okay. Anything else, or is that it for today?
Is active model naming how you associate a Poro with active model and get the validations and be able to create a form without using form tags?
Yeah, it gives you a lot of the kind of helpers that figure that out. So that's what's going to take your Poro, the class name of your Poro, and spit that out into a URL and stuff like that. So it makes your Poros behave in your forms very similar to an actual active record model.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So I want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask. Yeah, I was going to ask about when you use the active models this way, right? And kind of they sometimes function like an aggregate, right? Where they're going to manipulate multiple active models when you tell them to go to the database, right? So you submit your post, you set a couple params on the active model, and now it's going to touch multiple models, right? So when you build these things, do you make them kind of look like active record objects? Do you give them a save method so that it looks like that? Or do you give them a more specific domain specific name that says what they are going to do?
Good question. It's kind of a case by case basis. It depends on how conceptually close the actions are to what I would do with any active record model anyway. There certainly have been cases where I thought it made a lot of sense to have a dot save. I don't remember. I seem to vaguely recall something to do with payments, and when you did dot save, it would make an API call or something like that. I'm really not sure. But what I can say for sure is I treat those on a case by case basis, and sometimes it does mirror active record and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. In my opinion, I try to follow the active record process as much as I can. Really not for my own benefit, but the idea is a year from now, 2 years from now, I've got to come back and look at it, or somebody else has got to come back and look at it. And so if you use like those same method names that you would expect in active record, like save, that it becomes easier to follow.
Totally agree. I'm thinking of the principle of least astonishment. Yeah, so that's the idea. You know, if you see something and you expect it to work the same way everything else works, then it's really convenient if it does work the way everything else works. And maybe if you go in and it happens not to be database backed, but it has the active model mixed in, if that's just an incidental detail, then it doesn't matter. What you obviously wouldn't want to do is create something that's deceiving, where again, you wouldn't want to violate the principle of least astonishment, where if you do dot save, it does something wildly different from what you would expect. That would obviously be bad. But like Jim said, if it conforms to the active record naming conventions and stuff like that, in most cases, I think that could be a great benefit.
Yeah, and I also try to make sure that I return the same thing that the active record object would return. So if I say save, I'm going to return true or false. I'm also going to run validations prior to doing the save, to save that life cycle and make sure that I'm always returning the same thing that I would in active record.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
One thing that
go ahead.
One reason you might want to deviate from that naming convention is if to make a point. I'm thinking about some of the stuff that going back to DHH with Basecamp, they talk about incinerating records, not just deleting stuff, because when they actually incinerate it, it's gone. So by having something there a little bit different than what's kind of conventional, it kind of makes it stand out. So before you incinerate all your stuff, it's good to kind of take note of that.
Yeah, and actually kind of along that same point, don't quote me exactly on this, and I wasn't around this time, but I'm pretty sure back years ago, there was something called active resource they were working on for a while. And I think they actually scrapped that because some of the naming was found to be confusing because it was trying to mirror a lot of like active record stuff or something like that. I don't remember it. I read this article a long time. I think it was some DHH wrote a blog post about it actually, but yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I either never heard about that or don't remember.
I believe active resource was to make it easier to call external APIs originally.
Yeah.
And yeah, it had a really limited shelf life.
Yeah, because I think they were trying to, from what I remember, you write about it interacting with APIs and stuff, but it was trying to they were trying to reuse a lot of like the same method names and such, like active record and stuff, and it was just like far too confusing for everybody, so they decided to scrap it.
Okay. Any other thoughts from anybody before we head toward a conclusion? Okay. One thing I usually like to ask at the end is what you guys want to see in future sessions. I actually have a couple ideas of my own, so I'm going to pull up my notes and jot down a couple ideas. You guys are talking about APIs and stuff. And that made me realize we could talk about consuming APIs and also building APIs, including structure and documentation and stuff like that. That might be an interesting topic for people. Anyway, do you guys have any thoughts for ideas that you want to see in the future?
One of the things that I have one junior who's learning Rails, right? And so we're trying to establish some common conventions and practices, and we can't quite decide. So anytime we're writing code that is doing something to a has many, right? So customer has many orders. So anytime I'm writing code that is doing something to orders, we can't quite decide what our convention should be on when it should use enumerable methods and when it should use active record relation methods. Right? So should it use where or should it use filter? And how do we decide when and where we do that? We kind of have some ideas, but I would be curious to see what other people do.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to make a note of that. Yeah, active record relation methods versus enumerables. And I imagine, Chris, even, it's important for me to remember that these meetings include people everywhere on the spectrum of experience. And a lot of people are just starting out. And so even like the distinction between active record relation methods and enumerables, like what even are those things? And I myself could stand to have a firmer grasp even on that. So I think that would be a great thing for us to talk about. And I might reach out to you after this to see if you're open to like participating in that discussion with me or something, but I'll get a hold of you afterward for that. Great. I think that's a good topic. Any other topic ideas? Okay. Well, I will add those to the list at least. And as always, thanks a lot, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Good night,
Yeah, later.
Jason. Thanks much.